The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Dr. Watson, read by Corrie Samuel.
Sherlock Holmes, read by Ariel Lipshaw.
Dr. Mortimer, read by Robert Hoffman.
Sir Henry Baskerville, read by Elizabeth Klett.
Barrymore, read by Alan Johns.
Cartwright, read by Todd.
Stapleton, read by M.B.
Beryl Stapleton, read by Tricia G.
Laura Lyons, read by Amanda Friday.
Inspector Lestrade, read by David Lawrence.
Wilson, read by Omwantutre.
The Clerk, read by April Gonzalez.
Waiter, read by Ellie.
Cabman, read by Laurie Ann Walden.
Perkins, read by Grace Garrett.
Postmaster, read by Charlotte Duckett.
James, read by Tiffany Haller Colonna.
Mrs. Barrymore, read by Avai.
Frankland, read by Martin Geeson.
Chapter 1. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who was usually very late in the mornings, save upon those not infrequent occasions when he was up all night, was seated at the breakfast table. I stood upon the hearth-rug, and picked up the stick which our visitor had left behind him the night before. It was a fine, thick piece of wood, bulbous-headed, of the sort which is known as a Penang lawyer. Just under the head was a broad silver band nearly an inch across. To James Mortimer, M.R.C.S., from his friends of the C.C.H., was engraved upon it, with the date 1884. It was just such a stick as the old-fashioned family practitioner used to carry, dignified, solid, and reassuring.
Well, Watson, what do you make of it?
Holmes was sitting with his back to me, and I had given him no sign of my occupation. How did you know what I was doing? I believe you have eyes in the back of your head.
I have at least a well-polished silver-plated coffee-pot in front of me,
said he.
But tell me, Watson, what do you make of our visitor's stick? Since we have been so unfortunate as to miss him and have no notion of his errand, this accidental souvenir becomes of importance. Let me hear you reconstruct the man by an examination of it.
I think, said I, following as far as I could the methods of my companion, that Dr. Mortimer is a successful elderly medical man, well esteemed since those who know him give him this mark of their appreciation.
Good,
said Holmes.
Excellent.
I think also that the probability is in favour of his being a country practitioner who does a great deal of his visiting on foot.
Why so?
Because this stick, though originally a very handsome one, has been so knocked about that I can hardly imagine a town practitioner carrying it. The thick iron ferrule is worn down, so it is evident that he has done a great amount of walking with it.
Perfectly sound,
said Holmes. And then again, there is the Friends of the C.C.H. I should guess that to be the something hunt, the local hunt to whose members he has possibly given some surgical assistance, and which has made him a small presentation in return.
Really, Watson, you excel yourself, said
Holmes, pushing back his chair and lighting a cigarette.
I am bound to say that in all the accounts which you have been so good as to give of my own small achievements, you have habitually underrated your own abilities. It may be that you are not yourself luminous, but you are a conductor of light. Some people, without possessing genius, have a remarkable power of stimulating it. I confess, my dear fellow, that I am very much in your debt.
He had never said as much before, and I must admit that his words gave me keen pleasure, for I had often been piqued by his indifference to my admiration, and to the attempts which I had made to give publicity to his methods. I was proud, too, to think that I had so far mastered his system as to apply it in a way which earned his approval. He now took the stick from my hands, and examined it for a few minutes with his naked eyes. Then, with an expression of interest, he laid down his cigarette, and carrying the cane to the window, he looked it over again with a convex lens.
Interesting, though elementary,
said he as he returned to his favourite corner of the settee.
There are certainly one or two indications upon the stick. It gives us the basis for several deductions.
Has anything escaped me? I asked with some self-importance. I trust that there is nothing of consequence which I have overlooked.
I am afraid, my dear Watson, that most of your conclusions were erroneous. When I said that you stimulated me, I meant, to be frank, that in noting your fallacies I was occasionally guided towards the truth. Not that you are entirely wrong in this instance. The man is certainly a country practitioner, and he walks a good deal.
Then I was right.
To that extent.
But that was all?
No, my dear Watson, not all. By no means all. I would suggest, for example, that a presentation to a doctor is more likely to come from a hospital than from a hunt, and that when the initials C.C. are placed before that hospital, the words Charing Cross very naturally suggest themselves.
You may be right.
The probability lies in that direction. And if we take this as a working hypothesis, we have a fresh basis from which to start our construction of this unknown visitor.
Well then, supposing that CCH does stand for Charing Cross Hospital, what further inferences may we draw?
Do none suggest themselves? You know my methods. Apply them.
I can only think of the obvious conclusion that the man has practised in town before going to the country.
I think that we might venture a little farther than this. Look at it in this light. On what occasion would it be most probable that such a presentation would be made? When would his friends unite to give him a pledge of their goodwill? Obviously at the moment when Dr. Mortimer withdrew from the service of the hospital in order to start a practice for himself. We know there has been a presentation. We believe there has been a change from a town hospital to a country practice. Is it then stretching our inference too far to say that the presentation was on the occasion of the change?
It certainly seems probable.
Now, you will observe that he could not have been on the staff of the hospital, since only a man well established in a London practice could hold such a position, and such a one would not drift into the country. What was he then? If he was in the hospital and yet not on the staff, he could only have been a house surgeon or a house physician, little more than a senior student. And he left 5 years ago. The date is on the stick. So your grave, middle-aged family practitioner vanishes into thin air, my dear Watson, and there emerges a young fellow under 30, amiable, unambitious, absent-minded, and the possessor of a favourite dog, which I should describe roughly as being larger than a terrier and smaller than a mastiff.
I laughed incredulously as Sherlock Holmes leaned back in his settee and blew little wavering rings of smoke up to the ceiling. "As to the latter part, I have no means of checking you," said I, "but at least it is not difficult to find out a few particulars about the man's age and professional career." From my small medical shelf I took down the medical directory and turned up the name. There were several Mortimers, but only one who could be our visitor. I read his record aloud. Mortimer James, M.R.C.S., 1882, Grimpen, Dartmoor, Devon. House surgeon from 1882 to 1884 at Charing Cross Hospital. Winner of the Jackson Prize for Comparative Pathology, with essay entitled Is Disease a Reversion? Corresponding member of the Swedish Pathological Society. Author of Some Freaks of Atavism, Lancet, 1882. Do We Progress? Journal of Psychology, March 1883. Medical officer for the parishes of Grimpen, Thorsley and High Barrow.
No mention of that local hunt, Watson,
said Holmes with a mischievous smile.
But a country doctor, as you very astutely observed. I think that I am fairly justified in my inferences. As to the adjectives, I said, if I remember right, amiable, unambitious, and absent-minded. It is my experience that it is only an amiable man in this world who receives testimonials, only an unambitious one who abandons a London career for the country, and only an absent-minded one who leaves his stick and not his visiting card after waiting an hour in your room.
And the dog?
Has been in the habit of carrying this stick behind his master. Being a heavy stick, the dog has held it tightly by the middle, and the marks of his teeth are very plainly visible. The dog's jaw, as shown in the space between these marks, is too broad in my opinion for a terrier, and not broad enough for a mastiff. It may have been. Yes, by Jove, it is a curly-haired spaniel.
He had risen and paced the room as he spoke. Now he halted in the recess of the window. There was such a ring of conviction in his voice that I glanced up in surprise. "My dear fellow, how can you possibly be so sure of that?"
For the very simple reason that I see the dog himself on our very doorstep, and there is the ring of its owner. Don't move, I beg you, Watson. He is a professional brother of yours, and your presence may be of assistance to me. Now is the dramatic moment of fate, Watson, when you hear a step upon the stair which is walking into your life, and you know not whether for good or ill. What does Dr. James Mortimer, the man of science, ask of Sherlock Holmes, the specialist in crime? Come in.
The appearance of our visitor was a surprise to me, since I had expected a typical country practitioner. He was a very tall, thin man, with a long nose like a beak, which jutted out between two keen grey eyes, set closely together and sparkling brightly from behind a pair of gold-rimmed glasses. He was clad in a professional but rather slovenly fashion, for his frock coat was dingy and his trousers frayed. Though young, his long back was already bowed, and he walked with a forward thrust of his head and a general air of peering benevolence. As he entered, his eyes fell upon the stick in Holmes's hand, and he ran towards it with an exclamation of joy.
"I am so very glad,"
said he.
"I was not sure whether I had left it here or in the shipping office. I would not lose that stick for the world."
A presentation, I see,
said Holmes.
"Yes, sir."
From Charing Cross Hospital?
"From one or two friends there on occasion of my marriage."
Dear, dear, that's bad,
said Holmes, shaking his head. Dr. Mortimer blinked through his glasses in mild astonishment.
"Why was it bad?"
Only that you have disarranged our little deductions. You're married, you say?
"Yes, sir. I married, and so left the hospital, and with it all hopes of a consulting practice. It was necessary to make a home of my own."
Come, come, we are not so far wrong after all,
said Holmes.
And now, Dr. James Mortimer.
"Mr., sir, Mr. A humble M.R.C.S."
And a man of precise mind, evidently.
"A dabbler in science, Mr. Holmes. A picker-up of shells on the shores of the great unknown ocean. I presume that it is Mr. Sherlock Holmes whom I am addressing, and not—"
No, this is my friend Dr. Watson.
"Glad to meet you, sir. I have heard your name mentioned in connection with that of your friend. You interest me very much, Mr. Holmes. I had hardly expected so dolichocephalic a skull, or such well-marked supraorbital development. Would you have any objection to my running my finger along your parietal fissure? A cast of your skull, sir, until the original is available, would be an ornament to any anthropological museum. It is not my intention to be fulsome, but I confess that I covet your skull."
Sherlock Holmes waved our strange visitor into a chair.
You are an enthusiast in your line of thought, I perceive, sir, as I am in mine,
said he.
I observe from your forefinger that you make your own cigarettes. Have no hesitation in lighting one.
The man drew out paper and tobacco, and twirled the one up in the other with surprising dexterity. He had long, quivering fingers, as agile and restless as the antennae of an insect. Holmes was silent, but his little darting glances showed me the interest which he took in our curious companion.
I presume, sir,
said he at last,
that it was not merely for the purpose of examining my skull that you have done me the honour to call here last night and again to-day.
"No, sir, no, though I am happy to have had the opportunity of doing that as well. I came to you, Mr. Holmes, because I recognized that I am myself an unpractical man, and because I am suddenly confronted with a most serious and extraordinary problem. Recognizing as I do that you are the second highest expert in Europe—"
"Indeed, sir. May I inquire who has the honour to be the first?"
asked Holmes with some asperity.
"To the man of precisely scientific mind, the work of Monsieur Bertillon must always appeal strongly."
"Then had you not better consult him?"
"I said, sir, to the precisely scientific mind, but as a practical man of affairs it is acknowledged that you stand alone. I trust, sir, that I have not inadvertently—"
"Just a little,"
said Holmes.
"I think, Dr. Mortimer, you would do wisely if without more ado you would kindly tell me plainly what the exact nature of the problem is in which you demand my assistance."
End of Chapter 1. Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 2. The Curse of the Baskervilles.
"I have in my pocket a manuscript,"
said Dr. James Mortimer.
"I observed it as you entered the room,"
said Holmes.
"It is an old manuscript."
"Early 18th century, unless it is a forgery."
"How can you say that, sir?"
"You have presented an inch or two of it to my examination all the time that you have been talking. It would be a poor expert who could not give the date of a document within a decade or so. You may possibly have read my little monograph upon the subject. I put that at 1730.
The exact date is 1742.
Dr. Mortimer drew it from his breast pocket.
This family paper was committed to my care by Sir Charles Baskerville, whose sudden and tragic death 3 months ago created so much excitement in Devonshire. I may say that I was his personal friend as well as his medical attendant. He was a strong-minded man, sir, shrewd, practical, and as unimaginative as I am myself. Yet he took this document very seriously, and his mind was prepared for just such an end as did eventually overtake him.
Holmes stretched out his hand for the manuscript, and flattened it upon his knee.
You will observe, Watson, the alternative use of the long S and the short. It is one of several indications which enabled me to fix the date.
I looked over his shoulder at the yellow paper and the faded script. At the head was written Baskerville Hall, and below in large scrawling figures, 1742.
It appears to be a statement of some sort.
Yes, it is a statement of a certain legend which runs in the Baskerville family.
But I understand that it is something more modern and practical upon which you wish to consult me.
Most modern, a most practical pressing matter which must be decided within 24 hours. But the manuscript is short and is intimately connected with the affair. With your permission, I will read it to you.
Holmes leaned back in his chair, placed his fingertips together, and closed his eyes with an air of resignation. Dr. Mortimer turned the manuscript to the light, and read in a high, cracking voice the following curious old-world narrative.
Of the origin of the Hound of the Baskervilles there have been many statements, yet as I come in direct line from Hugo Baskerville, and as I had the story from my father, who also had it from his, I have set it down with all belief that it occurred even as it is here set forth. And I would have you believe, my sons, that the same justice which punishes sin may also most graciously forgive it, and that no ban is so heavy but that by prayer and repentance it may be removed. Learn then from this story not to fear the fruits of the past, but rather to be circumspect in the future, that those foul passions whereby our family has suffered so grievously may not again be loosed to our undoing. Know then that in the time of the Great Rebellion, the history of which, by the learned Lord Clarendon, I most earnestly commend to your attention, this manor of Baskerville was held by Hugo of that name. Nor can it be gainsaid that he was a most wild, profane, and godless man. This, in truth, his neighbours might have pardoned, seeing that saints have never flourished in those parts, but there was in him a certain wanton and cruel humour which made his name a byword through the West. It chanced that this Hugo came to love, if indeed so dark a passion may be known under so bright a name, the daughter of a yeoman who held lands near the Baskerville estate. But the young maiden, being discreet and of good repute, would ever avoid him, for she feared his evil name. So it came to pass that one Michaelmas this Hugo, with 5 or 6 of his idle and wicked companions, stole down upon the farm and carried off the maiden, her father and brothers being from home, as he well knew. When they had brought her to the hall, the maiden was placed in an upper chamber, while Hugo and his friends sat down to a long carouse, as was their nightly custom. Now, the poor lass upstairs was like to have her wits turned at the singing and shouting and terrible oaths which came up to her from below, for they say that the words used by Hugo Baskerville, when he was in wine, were such as might blast the man who said them. At last, in the stress of her fear, she did that which might have daunted the bravest or most active man, for by the aid of the growth of ivy which covered, and still covers, the south wall, she came down from under the eaves, and so homeward across the moor, there being 3 leagues betwixt the hall and her father's farm. It chanced that some little time later Hugo left his guests to carry food and drink, and other worse things, perchance, to his captive, and so found the cage empty and the bird escaped. Then, as it would seem, he became as one that hath a devil, for, rushing down the stairs into the dining hall, he sprang upon the great table, flagons and trenchers flying before him, and he cried aloud before all the company that he would that very night render his body and soul to the powers of evil if he might but overtake the wench. And while the revellers stood aghast at the fury of the man, One more wicked, or, it may be, more drunken than the rest, cried out that they should put the hounds upon her, whereat Hugo ran from the house, crying to the grooms that they should saddle his mare and unkennel the pack, and giving the hounds a kerchief of the maid's, he swung them to the line, and so off full cry into the moonlight over the moor. Now, for some space the revellers stood agape, unable to understand all that had been done in such haste. But anon their bemused wits awoke to the nature of the deed which was like to be done upon the moorlands. Everything was now in an uproar, some calling for their pistols, some for their horses, and some for another flask of wine. But at length some sense came back to their crazed minds, and the whole of them, 13 in number, took horse and started in pursuit. The moon shone clear above them, and they rode swiftly abreast, taking that course which the maid must needs have taken if she were to reach her own home. They had gone a mile or two when they passed one of the night shepherds upon the moorlands, and they cried to him to know if he had seen the hunt, and the man, as the story goes, was so crazed with fear that he could scarce speak, but at last he said that he had indeed seen the unhappy maiden with the hounds upon her track. "But I have seen more than that," said he, "for Hugo Baskerville passed me upon his black mare, and there ran mute behind him such a hound of hell as God forbid should ever be at my heels." So the drunken squires cursed the shepherd and rode onward. But soon their skins turned cold, for there came a galloping across the moor, and the black mare, dabbled with white froth, went past with trailing bridle and empty saddle. Then the revellers rode close together, for a great fear was on them, but they still followed over the moor, though each, had he been alone, would have been right glad to have turned his horse's head. Riding slowly in this fashion, they came at last upon the hounds. These, though known for their valour and their breed, were whimpering in a cluster at the head of a deep dip or goyal, as we call it, upon the moor, some slinking away, and some, with startling hackles and staring eyes, gazing down the narrow valley before them. The company had come to a halt, more sober men, as you may guess, than when they started. The most of them would by no means advance, but 3 of them, the boldest, or it may be the most drunken, rode forward down the goyal. Now, it opened into a broad space in which stood 2 of those great stones, still to be seen there, which were set by certain forgotten peoples in the days of old. The moon was shining bright upon the clearing, and there in the centre lay the unhappy maid where she had fallen, dead of fear and fatigue. But it was not the sight of her body, nor yet was it that of the body of Hugo Baskerville lying near her, which raised the hair upon the heads of these 3 daredevil roysters, but it was that, standing over Hugo, and plucking at his throat, there stood a foul thing, a great black beast, shaped like a hound, yet larger than any hound that ever mortal eye has rested upon. And even as they looked, the thing tore the throat out of Hugo Baskerville, on which, as it turned its blazing eyes and dripping jaws upon them, the 3 shrieked with fear and rode for dear life, still screaming across the moor. One, it is said, died that very night of what he had seen, and the other 2 were but broken men for the rest of their days. Such is the tale, my sons, of the coming of the hound which is said to have plagued the family so sorely ever since. If I have set it down, it is because that which is clearly known hath less terror than that which is but hinted at and guessed, nor can it be denied that many of the family have been unhappy in their deaths, which have been sudden, bloody, and mysterious. Yet may we shelter ourselves in the infinite goodness of Providence, which would not for ever punish the innocent beyond the 3rd or 4th generation which is threatened in Holy Writ. To that Providence, my sons, I hereby commend you, and I counsel you by way of caution to forbear from crossing the moor in those dark hours when the powers of evil are exalted. This from Hugo Baskerville to his sons Roger and John, with instructions that they say nothing thereof to their sister Elizabeth.
When Dr. Mortimer had finished reading this singular narrative, he pushed his spectacles up on his forehead, and stared across at Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The latter yawned, and tossed the end of his cigarette into the fire.
"Well,"
said he.
Do you not find it interesting?
To a collector of fairy tales.
Dr. Mortimer drew a folded newspaper out of his pocket.
Now, Mr. Holmes, we will give you something a little more recent. This is the Devon County Chronicle of May 14th of this year. It is a short account of the facts elicited at the death of Sir Charles Baskerville, which occurred a few days before that date.
My friend leaned a little forward, and his expression became intent. Our visitor readjusted his glasses and began.
The recent sudden death of Sir Charles Baskerville, whose name has been mentioned as the probable Liberal candidate for Mid Devon at the next election, has cast a gloom over the county. Though Sir Charles had resided at Baskerville Hall for a comparatively short period, his amiability of character and extreme generosity had won the affection and respect of all who had been brought into contact with him. In these days of nouveau riches it is refreshing to find a case where the scion of an old county family which has fallen upon evil days is able to make his own fortune and to bring it back with him to restore the fallen grandeur of his line. Sir Charles, as is well known, made large sums of money in South African speculation. More wise than those who go on until the wheel turns against them, he realized his gains and returned to England with them. It is only 2 years since he took up his residence at Baskerville Hall, and it is common talk how large were those schemes of reconstruction and improvement which have been interrupted by his death. Being himself childless, it was his openly expressed desire that the whole countryside should, within his own lifetime, profit by his good fortune, and many will have personal reasons for bewailing his untimely end. His generous donations to local and county charities have been frequently chronicled in these columns. The circumstances connected with the death of Sir Charles cannot be said to have been entirely cleared up by the inquest, but at least enough has been done to dispose of those rumours to which local superstition has given rise. There is no reason whatever to suspect foul play, or to imagine that death could be from any but natural causes. Sir Charles was a widower, and a man who may be said to have been in some ways of an eccentric habit of mind. In spite of his considerable wealth, he was simple in his personal tastes, and his indoor servants at Baskerville Hall consisted of a married couple named Barrymore, the husband acting as a butler and the wife as a housekeeper. Their evidence, corroborated by that of several friends, tends to show that Sir Charles's health has for some time been impaired, and points especially to some affection of the heart, manifesting itself in changes of color, breathlessness, and acute attacks of nervous depression. Dr. James Mortimer, the friend and medical attendant of the deceased, has given evidence to the same effect. The facts of the case are simple. Sir Charles Baskerville was in the habit every night before going to bed of walking down the famous yew alley of Baskerville Hall. The evidence of the Barrymores shows that this had been his custom. On the 4th of May, Sir Charles had declared his intention of starting next day for London, and had ordered Barrymore to prepare his luggage. That night he went out as usual for his nocturnal walk, in the course of which he was in the habit of smoking a cigar. He never returned. At 12 o'clock Barrymore, finding the hall door still open, became alarmed, and, lighting a lantern, went in search of his master. The day had been wet, and Sir Charles's footmarks were easily traced down the alley. Halfway down this walk there is a gate which leads out onto the moor. There were indications that Sir Charles had stood for some little time here. He then proceeded down the alley, and it was at the far end of it that his body was discovered. One fact which has not been explained is the statement of Barrymore that his master's footprints altered their character from the time that he passed the moor gate, and that he appeared from thence onward to have been walking upon his toes. One Murphy, a gipsy horse dealer, was on the moor at no great distance at the time, but he appears by his own confession to have been the worse for drink. He declares that he heard cries, but is unable to state from what direction they came. No signs of violence were to be discovered upon Sir Charles's person, and though the doctor's evidence pointed to an almost incredible facial distortion, so great that Dr. Mortimer refused at first to believe that it was indeed his friend and patient who lay before him, it was explained that this is a symptom which is not unusual in cases of dyspnea and death from cardiac exhaustion. This explanation was borne out by the post-mortem examination, which showed long-standing organic disease, and the coroner's jury returned a verdict in accordance with the medical evidence. It is well that this is so, for it is obviously of the utmost importance that Sir Charles's heir should settle at the Hall and continue the good work which had been so sadly interrupted. Had the prosaic finding of the coroner not finally put an end to the romantic stories which have been whispered in connection with the affair, it might have been difficult to find a tenant for Baskerville Hall. It is understood that the next of kin is Mr. Henry Baskerville, if he is still alive, the son of Sir Charles Baskerville's younger brother. The young man when last heard of was in America, and inquiries are being instituted with a view to informing him of his good fortune.
Dr. Mortimer refolded his paper and replaced it in his pocket.
Those are the public facts, Mr. Holmes, in connection with the death of Sir Charles Baskerville.
I must thank you,
said Sherlock Holmes,
for calling my attention to a case which certainly presents some features of interest. I had observed some newspaper comment at the time, but I was exceedingly preoccupied by that little affair of the Vatican cameos, and in my anxiety to oblige the Pope I lost touch with several interesting English cases. This article, you say, contains all the public facts?
It does.
Then let me have the private ones.
He leaned back, put his fingertips together, and assumed his most impassive and judicial expression.
In doing so,
said Dr. Mortimer, who had begun to show signs of some strong emotion,
I am telling that which I have not confided to anyone. My motive for withholding it from the coroner's inquiry is that a man of science shrinks from placing himself in the public position of seeming to endorse a popular superstition. I had the further motive that Baskerville Hall would certainly remain untenanted if anything were done to increase its already rather grim reputation. For both these reasons I thought that I was justified in telling rather less than I knew, since no practical good could result from it, but with you there is no reason why I should not be perfectly frank. The moor is very sparsely inhabited, and those who live near each other are thrown very much together. For this reason I saw a good deal of Sir Charles Baskerville. With the exception of Mr. Frankland of Lafter Hall, and Mr. Stapleton, the naturalist, there are no other men of education within many miles. Sir Charles was a retiring man, but the chance of his illness brought us together, and a community of interest in science kept us so. He had brought back much scientific information from South Africa, and many a charming evening we have spent together discussing the comparative anatomy of a bushman and the Hottentot. Within the last few months it became increasingly plain to me that Sir Charles's nervous system was strained to the breaking point. He had taken this legend which I have read to you exceedingly to heart, so much so that, although he would walk in his own grounds, nothing would induce him to go out upon the moor at night. Incredible as it may appear to you, Mr. Holmes, he was honestly convinced that a dreadful fate overhung his family, and certainly the records which he was able to give of his ancestors were not encouraging. The idea of some ghastly presence constantly haunted him, and on more than one occasion he has asked me whether I had, on my medical journeys at night, ever seen any strange creature or heard the baying of a hound. The latter question he put to me several times, and always with a voice which vibrated with excitement. I can well remember driving up to his house in the evening some 3 weeks before the fatal event. He chanced to be at his hall door. I had descended from my gig and was standing in front of him, when I saw his eyes fix themselves over my shoulder and stare past me with an expression of the most dreadful horror. I whisked round, and had just time to catch a glimpse of something which I took to be a large black calf passing at the head of the drive. So excited and alarmed was he that I was compelled to go down to the spot where the animal had been, and look around for it. It was gone, however, and the incident appeared to make the worst impression upon his mind. I stayed with him all the evening, and it was on that occasion, to explain the emotion which he had shown, that he confided to my keeping that narrative which I read to you when I first came. I mention this small episode because it assumes some importance in view of the tragedy which followed, but I was convinced at the time that the matter was entirely trivial and this excitement had no justification. It was my advice that Sir Charles was about to go to London. His heart was, I knew, affected, and the constant anxiety in which he lived, however chimerical the cause of it might be, was evidently having a serious effect upon his health. I thought that a few months among the distractions of town would send him back a new man. Mr. Stapleton, a mutual friend who was much concerned at his state of health, was of the same opinion. At the last instant came this terrible catastrophe. On the night of Sir Charles's death, Barrymore, the butler, who made the discovery, sent Perkins the groom on horseback to me, and as I was sitting up late I was able to reach Baskerville Hall within an hour of the event. I checked and corroborated all the facts which were mentioned at the inquest. I followed the footsteps down the yew alley. I saw the spot at the moor gate where he seemed to have waited. I remarked the change in the shape of the prints after that point. I noted that there were no other footsteps save those of Barrymore on the soft gravel, and finally I carefully examined the body, which had not been touched until my arrival. Sir Charles lay on his face, arms out, his fingers dug into the ground, and his features convulsed with some strong emotion to such an extent that I could hardly have sworn to his identity. There was certainly no physical injury of any kind, but one false statement was made by Barrymore at the inquest. He said that there were no traces upon the ground round the body. He did not observe any, but I did, some little distance off, but fresh and clear.
Footprints.
Footprints.
A man's or a woman's?
Dr. Mortimer looked strangely at us for an instant, and his voice sank almost to a whisper as he answered,
Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound.
End of chapter 2. Thrill in the doctor's voice, which showed that he was himself deeply moved by that which he told us. Holmes leaned forward in his excitement, and his eyes had the hard, dry glitter which shot from them when he was keenly interested.
You saw this?
As clearly as I see you.
And you said nothing?
What was the use?
How was it that no one else saw it?
The marks were some 20 yards from the body, and no one gave them a thought. I don't suppose I should have done so had I not known this legend.
There are many sheepdogs on the moor.
No doubt, but this was no sheepdog.
You say it was large.
Enormous.
But it had not approached the body?
No.
What sort of night was it?
Damp and raw.
But not actually raining?
No.
What is the alley like?
There are 2 lines of old yew hedge, 12 feet high and impenetrable. The walk in the center is about 8 feet across.
Is there anything between the hedges and the walk?
Yes, there is a strip of grass about 6 feet broad on either side.
I understand that the yew hedge is penetrated at one point by a gate.
Yes, the wicket gate which leads onto the moor.
Is there any other opening?
None.
So that to reach the yew alley one either has to come down it from the house or else to enter it by the moor gate.
There is an exit through a summer house at the far end.
Had Sir Charles reached this?
No, he lay about 50 yards from it.
Now tell me, Dr. Mortimer, and this is important, the marks which you saw were on the path and not on the grass.
No marks could show on the grass.
Were they on the same side of the path as the moor gate?
Yes, they were on the edge of the path on the same side as the moor gate.
You interest me exceedingly. Another point. Was the wicket gate closed?
Closed and padlocked.
How high was it?
About 4 feet high.
Then anyone could have got over it.
Yes.
And what marks did you see by the wicket gate?
None in particular.
Good heaven, did no one examine?
Yes, I examined myself.
And found nothing?
It was all very confused. Sir Charles had evidently stood there for 5 or 10 minutes.
How do you know that?
Because the ash had twice dropped from his cigar.
Excellent. This is a colleague, Watson, after our own heart. But the marks?
He had left his own marks all over that small patch of gravel. I could discern no others.
Sherlock Holmes struck his hand against his knee with an impatient gesture.
If I had only been there,
he cried.
It is evidently a case of extraordinary interest and one which presented immense opportunities to the scientific expert. That gravel page upon which I might have read so much has been long ere this smudged by the rain and defaced by the clogs of curious peasants. Oh, Dr. Mortimer, to think that you should not have called me in. You have indeed much to answer for.
I could not call you in, Mr. Holmes, without disclosing these facts to the world, and I have already given my reasons for not wishing to do so. Besides...
Why do you hesitate?
There is a realm in which the most acute and most experienced of detectives is helpless.
You mean that the thing is supernatural?
I did not positively say so.
No, but you evidently think it.
Since the tragedy, Mr. Holmes, there have come to my ears several incidents which are hard to reconcile with the settled order of nature.
For example?
I find that before the terrible event occurred, several people had seen a creature upon the moor which corresponds with this Baskerville demon, and which could not possibly be any animal known to science. They all agreed that it was a huge creature, luminous, ghastly, and spectral. I have cross-examined these men, one of them a hard-headed countryman, one a farrier, and one a moorland farmer, who all tell the same story of this dreadful apparition, exactly corresponding to the hell-hound of the legend. I assure you that there is a reign of terror in the district, and that it is a hardy man who will cross the moor at night.
And you, a trained man of science, believe it to be supernatural?
I do not know what to believe.
Holmes shrugged his shoulders.
I have hitherto confined my investigations to this world,
said he.
In a modest way I have combated evil, but to take on the father of evil himself would, perhaps, be too ambitious a task. Yet you must admit that the footmark is material.
The original Hound was material enough to tug a man's throat out, and yet he was diabolical as well.
I see that you have quite gone over to the supernaturalists. But now, Dr. Mortimer, tell me this. If you hold these views, why have you come to consult me at all? You tell me in the same breath that it is useless to investigate Sir Charles's death, and that you desire me to do it.
I did not say that I desired you to do it.
Then how can I assist you?
By advising me as to what I should do with Sir Henry Baskerville, who arrives at Waterloo Station.
Dr. Mortimer looked at his watch.
In exactly 1 hour and a quarter.
He being the heir?
Yes. On the death of Sir Charles we inquired for this young gentleman and found that he had been farming in Canada. From the accounts which have reached us he is an excellent fellow in every way. I speak now not as a medical man, but as a trustee and executor of Sir Charles's will.
There is no other claimant, I presume?
None. The only other kinsman whom we have been able to trace was Roger Baskerville, the youngest of 3 brothers, of whom poor Sir Charles was the elder. The second brother, who died young, is the father of this lad Henry. The third, Roger, was the black sheep of the family. He came of the old masterful Baskerville strain, and was the very image, they tell me, of the family picture of old Hugo. He made England too hot to hold him, fled to Central America, and died there in 1876 of yellow fever. Henry is the last of the Baskervilles. In 1 hour and 5 minutes I meet him at Waterloo Station. I have had a wire that he arrived at Southampton this morning. Now, Mr. Holmes, what would you advise me to do with him?
Why should he not go to the home of his fathers?
It seems natural, does it not? And yet, consider that every Baskerville who goes there meets with an evil fate. I feel sure that if Sir Charles could have spoken with me before his death, he would have warned me against bringing this, the last of the old race, and the heir to great wealth, to that deadly place. And yet it cannot be denied that the prosperity of the whole poor, bleak countryside depends upon his presence. All the good work which has been done by Sir Charles will crash to the ground if there is no tenant of the hall. I fear lest I should be swayed too much by my own obvious interest in the matter, and that is why I bring the case before you and ask for your advice.
Holmes considered for a little time.
Put into plain words, the matter is this,
said he.
In your opinion there is a diabolical agency which makes Dartmoor an unsafe abode for a Baskerville. That is your opinion.
At least I might go to the length of saying that there is some evidence that this may be so.
Exactly. But surely, if your supernatural theory be correct, it could work the young man evil in London as easily as in Devonshire. A devil with merely local powers like a parish vestry would be too inconceivable a thing.
You put the matter more flippantly, Mr. Holmes, than you would probably do if you were brought into personal contact with these things. Your advice, then, as I understand it, is that the young man will be as safe in Devonshire as in London. He comes in 50 minutes. What would you recommend?
I recommend, sir, that you take a cab, call off your spaniel who is scratching at my front door, and proceed to Waterloo to meet Sir Henry Baskerville.
And then?
And then you will say nothing to him at all until I have made up my mind about the matter.
How long will it take you to make up your mind?
24 hours. At 10 o'clock tomorrow, Dr. Mortimer, I will be much obliged to you if you will call upon me here, and it will be of help to me in my plans for the future if you will bring Sir Henry Baskerville with you.
I will do so, Mr. Holmes.
He scribbled the appointment on his shirt cuff, and hurried off in his strange, peering, absent-minded fashion. Holmes stopped him at the head of the stair.
Only one more question, Dr. Mortimer. You say that before Sir Charles Baskerville's death, several people saw this apparition upon the moor.
3 people did.
Did any see it after?
I have not heard of any.
Thank you. Good morning.
Holmes returned to his seat with that quiet look of inward satisfaction which meant that he had a congenial task before him.
Going out, Watson?
Unless I can help you.
No, my dear fellow, it is at the hour of action that I turn to you for aid. But this is splendid, really unique from some points of view. When you pass Bradley's, would you ask him to send up a pound of the strongest shag tobacco? Thank you. It would be as well if you could make it convenient not to return before evening. Then I should be very glad to compare impressions as to this most interesting problem which has been submitted to us this morning.
I knew that seclusion and solitude were very necessary for my friend in those hours of intense mental concentration during which he weighed every particle of evidence, constructed alternative theories, balanced one against the other, and made up his mind as to which points were essential and which immaterial. I therefore spent the day at my club, and did not return to Baker Street until evening. It was nearly 9 o'clock when I found myself in the sitting-room once more. My first impression as I opened the door was that a fire had broken out, for the room was so filled with smoke that the light of the lamp upon the table was blurred by it. As I entered, however, my fears were set at rest, for it was the acrid fumes of strong, coarse tobacco which took me by the throat and set me coughing. Through the haze I had a vague vision of Holmes in his dressing-gown, coiled up in an armchair with his black clay pipe between his lips. Several rolls of paper lay around him.
"Caught cold, Watson?"
said he. "No, it's this poisonous atmosphere."
"I suppose it is pretty thick, now that you mention it."
"Thick? It is intolerable."
"Open the window, then. You have been at your club all day, I perceive."
"My dear Holmes."
"Am I right?"
"Certainly. But how?" He laughed at my bewildered expression.
"There is a delightful freshness about you, Watson, which makes it a pleasure to exercise any small powers which I possess at your expense. A gentleman goes forth on a showery and miry day. He returns immaculate in the evening, with the gloss still on his hat and his boots. He has been a fixture, therefore, all day. He is not a man with intimate friends. Where, then, could he have been? Is it not obvious?"
"Well, it is rather obvious."
"The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. Where do you think that I have been?"
"A fixture also."
"On the contrary, I have been to Devonshire."
"In spirit?"
"Exactly. My body has remained in this armchair, and has, I regret to observe, consumed in my absence 2 large pots of coffee and an incredible amount of tobacco. After you left I sent down to Stamford's for the ordnance map of this portion of the moor, and my spirit has hovered over it all day. I flatter myself that I could find my way about."
"A large-scale map, I presume?"
"Very large."
He unrolled one section and held it over his knee.
"Here you have the particular district which concerns us. That is Baskerville Hall in the middle."
"With a wood round it?"
"Exactly. I fancy the yew alley, though not marked under that name, must stretch along this line, with the moor, as you perceive, upon the right of it. This small clump of buildings here is the hamlet of Grimpen, where our friend Dr. Mortimer has his headquarters. Within a radius of 5 miles there are, as you see, only a very few scattered dwellings. Here is Laughter Hall, which was mentioned in the narrative. There is a house indicated here which may be the residence of the naturalist. Stapleton, if I remember right, was his name. Here are 2 moorland farmhouses, High Tor and Foulmire. Then, 14 miles away, the great convict prison of Princetown. Between and around these scattered points extends the desolate, lifeless moor. This, then, is the stage upon which tragedy has been played, and upon which we may help to play it again."
"It must be a wild place."
"Yes, the setting is a worthy one. If the devil did desire to have a hand in the affairs of men—"
"Then you are yourself inclining to the supernatural explanation."
"The devil's agents may be of flesh and blood, may they not? There are 2 questions waiting for us at the outset. The one is whether any crime has been committed at all. The second is, what is the crime and how was it committed? Of course, if Dr. Mortimer's surmise should be correct, and we are dealing with forces outside the ordinary laws of nature, there is an end of our investigation. But we are bound to exhaust all other hypotheses before falling back upon this one. I think we'll shut that window again, if you don't mind. It is a singular thing, but I find that a concentrated atmosphere helps a concentration of thought. I have not pushed it to the length of getting into a box to think, but that is the logical outcome of my convictions. Have you turned the case over in your mind?
Yes, I have thought a good deal of it in the course of the day.
What do you make of it?
It is very bewildering.
It has certainly a character of its own. There are points of distinction about it. That change in the footprints, for example, what do you make of that?
Mortimer said that the man had walked on tiptoe down that portion of the alley.
He only repeated what some fool had said at the inquest. Why should a man walk on tiptoe down the alley?
What then?
He was running, Watson. Running desperately. Running for his life. Running until he burst his heart and fell dead upon his face.
Running from what?
There lies our problem. There are indications that the man was crazed with fear before ever he began to run.
How can you say that?
I am presuming that the cause of his fears came to him across the moor. If that was so, and it seems most probable, only a man who had lost his wits would have run from the house instead of towards it. If the gypsy's evidence may be taken as true, he ran with cries for help in the direction where help was least likely to be. Then again, whom was he waiting for that night, and why was he waiting for him in the yew alley rather than in his own house?
You think that he was waiting for someone?
The man was elderly and infirm. We can understand his taking an evening stroll, but the ground was damp and the night inclement. Is it natural that he should stand for 5 or 10 minutes, as Dr. Mortimer, with more practical sense than I should have given him credit for, deduced from the cigar ash?
But he went out every evening.
I think it unlikely that he waited at the moor-gate every evening. On the contrary, the evidence is that he avoided the moor. That night he waited there. It was the night before he made his departure for London. The thing takes shape, Watson. It becomes coherent. Might I ask you to hand me my violin, and we will postpone all further thought upon this business until we have had the advantage of meeting Dr. Mortimer and Sir Henry Baskerville in the morning.
End of chapter 3.